Hola, buenos días o buenas tardes. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Welcome back to this fifth lesson in our Advanced Spanish Grammar, Spanish 590, but in this case, 690, because this video really is exclusive for those graduate students. In this video, we're going to talk about the historical developments of grammar teaching, and I'm also going to introduce to you very superficially to some major concepts in the research when it comes to the instruction of grammar. So, overview. We'll talk about the purpose of the lesson for you graduate students. I'm going to give a brief historical overview of the developments in grammar teaching. We'll talk about the grammar translation method just because it was so important. And we'll also talk about what happened after that, grammar instruction after GTM or grammar translation method. I'm going to introduce some grammar teaching constructs and some grammar teaching types very briefly, give you some fancy labels to throw around. And I'll also go over some notes on the effectiveness of instruction in the SLA research. And then finally, I'm going to give you a couple of brief introductions to assignments that you as graduate students in Spanish 690 will be completing. Now those descriptions, detailed descriptions, and the templates for those will be available on Blackboard. So let's talk about why I'm doing this video and what I hope you'll learn. First, I just want to put grammar teaching in a broader historical context. Where are we now? Where have we come from, right? I really think it's important to talk about grammar translation method, its legacy in language teaching, right? It's still with us. I want to introduce those basic concepts that you can use to discuss grammar teaching intelligently. One of my hopes for you as graduate students after this course, right? Not necessarily the undergrads, but as graduate students, is that you can you can have your own ideas about the instruction of grammar, and you can defend those bouncing off ideas and concepts and constructs in the second language acquisition of literature. So if somebody comes up to you and says, there's no point in teaching grammar, students don't learn it, you can say, but that's not what so-and-so says, okay? And then I'm going to give you an overview of how to apply these concepts into assignments. All right, so let's talk about the history of grammar and grammar teaching. I read on Wikipedia, right? I Googled that as long as 4,000 years ago, right, Babylonian translators translating documents into, I think it was Sumerian, right, were creating and studying verb conjugation tables to aid them in their translation. It's one of the first known sort of emergences of systematic study of grammar. Now, back in classical antiquity, okay, the Greeks published grammars of their language as early as the 2nd century BC, right, and throughout classical times, I'm talking about classical antiquity, Greco-Roman times, right? These grammars were published from time to time, first in Greek and then imitated by the Romans, right? Because in the Greco-Roman learning tradition, grammar, the study of grammar, right, was thought to discipline the mind and the soul. It was really conceived of as the foundation of all knowledge. I mean, if you didn't know grammar, how could you learn anything else? Because grammar revealed the order, right, of nature and beyond, okay? And so, as you may know, the Greeks and Romans had a curriculum, right, that consisted of 7 core subjects, the trivium and the quadrivium. The very first and considered most important subject in the trivium was grammar, right? And that was accompanied by logic and rhetoric, okay? So, from antiquity through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance until the Industrial Revolution, grammar study meant studying those Greek, or more commonly later on, Middle Ages, Latin grammars. So if you think about those monks, right, cloistered in their towers, in their churches, in their monasteries, translating many times, right, applying grammar, the study of grammar was extremely important. Like I said, it was kind of seen as a gateway discipline, right? You couldn't study religion, theology, if you didn't have a sound understanding of grammar in medieval times and even thereafter. Okay, so it wasn't until, so like I said, until about the 17th, 18th centuries, the study of grammar was equated with the study of Latin grammar. It wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution started to take hold in Europe and England in particular and create a middle class. And by the way, many of these ideas, I want to credit my sources. Many of the ideas I've been talking about so far have come from Constance Weaver's book, Teaching Grammar in Context. The first chapter, she has some information about the development of grammar from antiquity forward. And she's the one that says that it was in the 18th century when the Industrial Revolution creates this emerging middle class that English-speaking people in the UK, what is now the UK, started to study their own language systematically, right? Across the Atlantic, here in the American colonies, right, it's interesting that in the curriculum of those early schools, grammar instruction was actually mandated by law, right? The early charters and constitutions of those colonies that would become the states mandated that grammar would be something that was taught in schools. And so that's where the term grammar school for like elementary school originated, if you're familiar with that. But what was grammar study like back in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century? It was the memorization of rules, right? Verb paradigms, structures, examples. In other words, what's missing here is actual practice, not necessarily actual use of grammar, right, in communication. And it wasn't until the mid-19th century, the 1850s, 60s, right, that these grammar practice activities started creeping into school books. Okay, so grammar, right, continued to be super important part of the elementary, junior high school curriculum until about the 1950s or 60s, and then it started disappearing, particularly in English-speaking countries from the curriculum, right? And it was sort of replaced by an emphasis on more communicative activities like composition, right, writing, right? However, in our domain, foreign language teaching, grammar retained a very strong foothold. So much so that if your experience is like mine, in high school, I don't remember learning about grammar. I remember an English composition class. I remember an English literature class. I don't remember an English grammar class, right? It was brought up. But in my foreign language classes, grammar was always a prominent feature. And I remember thinking many times, oh, this is what that means, because it was really sinking in due to that explicit instruction I received in my foreign language, in my case Spanish classes. However, as the 20th century moved on, progressed, right, 70s, 80s, a lot of foreign language teaching methods began to de-emphasize the instruction of grammar. Despite that, the effectiveness of grammar teaching is still a major focus in second language acquisition research. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's sort of a historical overview, right? Starting with the Babylonians through the Greeks, Romans, right? The English Industrial Revolution up until the end of the 20th century. So one of those areas in which grammar persisted, right, was foreign language instruction. And a lot of that's due to the influence of the grammar translation method. Many of you have heard me talk about this before in the translation class. Grammar translation, right, the GTM, the grammar translation method, is a cross-lingual method. What does that mean? An interlingual. It means you were using two languages. You were using the native language of your students, but you were also using the target language, and there was a lot of comparison and contrasting. This was introduced in the late 1700s, right, and it really hung on for a couple of hundred years. It drew on approaches for teaching classical languages that were being used at the time, the way that Greek and Latin were being taught. Grammar translation method focuses exclusively on the learning or memorization of grammar rules and structures. So students were taught parts of speech, they were taught rules, they were taught verb endings, right? And those were taught through explicit explanation. And then at different parts in the class, in the lesson, students would practice or apply these rules using translation, translating many times from the target language back into their native language. And that's how they were supposed to solidify and show mastery of the language rules that they learned explicitly. Now, in many respects, grammar translation method remains influential today. We still see a lot of explicit rule explanation in classrooms. And those of you who took my advanced translation class are familiar, right, with this book, Translation and Language Teaching by Guy Cook. He's a British linguist. He gives a lot of really excellent background about use of translation in the classroom and then how that fell out of favor. So what happened with the grammar translation method, right? Around the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, going into the early parts of the 20th century, a reform movement began among psychologists and linguistics. Both of those disciplines were becoming a little bit more solidified, right? A little more stable. They criticized grammar translation's emphasis on just the written language, on translation activities, and the use of unconnected or decontextualized sentences. Reform movement emphasized speech or oral production, speech over writing, connected text, so longer text, paragraphs, right, stories, and learning in and through the target language. So no more use of the student's native language, or L1. The reform movement linguists and psychologists thought that everything should be taught, delivered in the target language, and of course that sentiment is still very strong today. One result of the reform movement was the so-called direct method. These are all things you can Google, and I hope that you will. Sort of the precepts of the direct method, to really boil it down to its simplest form, is that instructors would never use a student's native language, right? No use of the L1, and so of course no translation. And sort of what they aspired to in their teaching was native speaker competence, all right? But the most important thing about the direct method to remember is that first language use was completely banned. Everything was in the target language. That doesn't mean that grammar instruction went away. Grammar instruction was still the focus of the direct method. The direct method was still very much focused on grammar forms. It just did it in the target language. Now, a lot of these so-called reforms didn't really catch on until after World War II. So grammar translation was still very influential. And although instruction was in the target language, it continued to be focused on grammar forms until the 1970s and 80s. What happened in the 1970s and 80s, you have the advent of communicative language teaching, the ideas of Stephen Krashen about language acquisition versus learning become very influential. So the advent of communicative language teaching, CLT, shifted the emphasis from form, from grammar, to meaning. So grammar instruction still occurs though, even in meaning-focused approaches like communicative language teaching, task-based, content-based instruction. There is still grammar instruction, or many researchers would say there is and there should be. Now, just a quick note on approaches, right? If you took teaching methods, or you might teach teaching methods soon, MCL 700 I believe it is, you may read from Richards and Rogers, right? Approaches and methods in language teaching. And one thing they do in that book that's very interesting is they systematically go through each approach and method, and they talk about the role of the instructor, the role of the learner, the type of syllabus. And so every major foreign language teaching approach or method takes a position on grammar teaching. It's good, it's bad, it should be done in this way, it should be done explicitly, it should be done deductively, inductively. Okay, we'll talk about some of those things in just a minute. After Krashen, but especially in the communicative language teaching era, grammar instruction has sort of fallen out of favor or become taboo. What do I mean? I mean, if you talk to colleagues from across the profession, different languages, ESL, EFL, Spanish, French, whatever the language happens to be, and you just were to say, I love teaching grammar in my class, they might look at you like, are you crazy, man? Have you not been paying attention? We don't teach grammar anymore. So that's a result of the influence of Krashen's ideas and some of the precepts of communicative language teaching, meaning-focused approaches. However, it's important to underscore that second language acquisition researchers continue to find positive effects for various types of grammar instruction. Get to that in a minute. One thing I want to do in this video is just to introduce you very superficially to some constructs or theories, models that are often referenced in connection with research on grammar instruction, grammar learning, some instruction types. Now this is a very, very basic introduction, and I do want you to Google every single one of these on your own time. And honestly, I recommend some of the Wikipedia articles. There's nothing wrong with them, but look for articles. Many of the articles that I've posted to Blackboard will cover some of these. So we're going to talk about explicit and implicit knowledge. We saw that a little bit in the previous video. I'm going to talk about two instructional focuses focused on form, when your instruction is form focused or meaning focused. We'll look at two different sort of approaches, focus on forms with an S and focus on form. Talk about different types of teaching as isolated versus integrated, deductive or inductive, right? And then I'm just going to list a few techniques. So again, if I can't tell you how important these two concepts is, or this distinction is, in the second language acquisition research, particularly as it pertains to instruction and grammar instruction, right? This distinction between implicit and explicit learning and knowledge. Okay, so remember, implicit learning is learning that happens without awareness. It happens incidentally, unconsciously, right? Implicit knowledge is stored in the brain. It's intuitive, it's abstract, it can be called upon to communicate spontaneously, but it's generally not verbalizable, right? Learners can't explain what they know implicitly. On the other hand, explicit learning, right, is a conscious, deliberate, intentional process. Explicit knowledge has to do with knowledge about language. It's a more conscious type, right? It would be what we know about our language, the rules that we can verbalize, okay? There's two major instructional focuses. So we can focus on form when we teach, or we can focus on meaning. We can say that our classroom is focused on form, or our classroom is focused on meaning. Let's look at FFI, right? Form-focused instruction. That's teaching that emphasizes grammar, structures, and forms, right? Versus MFI, or meaning-focused instruction. That's teaching that emphasizes meaning or communication over grammar, over forms. There's a couple types of form-focused instruction. One is focus on forms with an S. That is your traditional explicit explanation teaching of grammar forms. That, again, that can be in the student's native language, or it can be in the target language, right? I can explain verb conjugations. I can explain preposition uses. I can explain relative pronouns en español. Sigue siendo focus on forms. Okay? It's that discrete point grammar teaching. It's often isolated, decontextualized. Okay? So when I walk into the classroom and say, hoy vamos a practicar la distinción entre imperfecto y pretérito, o ser y estar, primero vamos a, right? That is discrete point grammar teaching. It's focus on forms. Focus on form is more of a technique or procedure, and it occurs within meaning-centered approaches. So the emphasis is on meaning and communication in the classroom. So think of communicative language teaching, content-based instruction, task-based language teaching, right? Where the focus is on meaning, negotiating meaning, comprehending meaning, or completing a task, but something comes up structurally, right, which impedes the learners from completing the task. At that point, the instructor might briefly shift into a mini, right, moment where he or she explains grammar, right? And that explanation can take various forms. It can be more or less deductive or inductive, more or less explicit or implicit. But it's grammar instruction that happens, right, because something comes up during task completion. So here's a definition of focus on form. Again, not to be confused with focus on forms. Google them, look up the difference. A focus on form is a concept that is attributed to the researcher Michael Long, right? And there's a really interesting, if you follow this link here, a very informative tutorial that he has. He makes a distinction between focus on meaning, focus on forms, and focus on form, which is sort of a synthesis. So for him, focus on form is when, during an otherwise meaning-focused lesson and using a variety of procedures, learners' attention is briefly shifted to linguistic code features in context when students experience programs as they work on a communicative task. So again, they're working on a communicative task, it's a meaning-focused lesson, but momentarily we shift their focus to a form that they need to complete that task, right? It's not a full-blown grammar lesson, it's something that comes up during the course of meaning-focused instruction. So those are two extremely important concepts, right? Focus on forms, the traditional teaching of grammar structures, and focus on form. Okay. Another important distinction you'll find in the literature and in teaching in general is this distinction between deductive and inductive teaching techniques. Okay. So what is meant by deductive instruction? Deductive reasoning is reasoning that goes from general, right, principles to specific examples. So in language teaching, in deductive instruction, right, instructors explain the rules to learners, right? So if we happen to be working on the irregular preterite verb forms, I explain those rules, the general rules, and I have the learners apply them to specific examples. This is, again, the more traditional, more explicit approach, okay? Because there are degrees of explicitness, going from very explicit to not as explicit, almost implicit, and then implicit, right? Closer to the not as explicit, almost implicit, is inductive instruction. Inductive reasoning is going from specific examples to general principles. So in language learning, inductive instruction means that we encourage learners to figure out, to discover in a way, and to figure out rules on the basis of exposure to examples or text that exemplify those rules. Okay? So learners are in effect asked to detect patterns in input and to generalize from those patterns rules in the language. And in inductive instruction, there are varying degrees of guidance that the instructor might provide, from zero guidance, in which case it's very close to implicit instruction, to a little more guidance. Be on the lookout for this, right? Where it becomes a little bit more explicit. So the difference between deductive is you're giving the learners the rule, and inductive instruction, you're helping, to varying degrees, learners detect and generalize those rules on their own. Now, I'm not going to get into what the research says about this too much, other than to say it's mixed, right? It's very mixed in terms of, is deductive or inductive instruction more effective? And it depends on a lot of factors. But it's a very interesting question. And now, just to give you an idea, right? There are many instructional techniques that we could characterize as an explicit technique, right? A deductive technique, a form-focused technique, right? A meaning-focused technique. And that's the point of this lesson. I want you to be able to intelligently discuss, and it's going to take a little bit more research, a little bit more Googling, a little bit more article reading, but now you have the parameters, right? I want you to be able to intelligently discuss types of grammar activities, to provide a rationale based on the construct, right? To be able to say, well, that's too explicit. I don't like teaching that explicitly, right? Or that's only going to contribute to the learned system, not the acquired system, because it results in explicit knowledge, right? Because you're using such a deductive approach. So these types of things are what I want you to be able to do. So I'm not going to even read these different techniques on the screen right now, but I'm just throwing those out there. Could you, with a little bit of study, right, if you looked up what, for example, input flood or input flooding is, could you have an intelligent conversation or write about this as being a technique or an activity that promotes implicit or explicit learning? Is it a more deductive or a more inductive technique? Is it something that would happen in a form-focused context or a more meaning-focused context? Okay. So take a good look, and of course there are some very basic grammar activities here, like explicit explanation of rules, the PPP model, presentation, practice, production, but there are some other ones that you might not be as familiar with. Processing instruction, input flooding, dictogloss, those are things that you can look up. All right, and then finally, need a drink of water here. I do want to spend a few minutes addressing the question of just how effective, right? How necessary, how effective is the effectiveness of instruction, particularly instruction of forms. What do SLA researchers say about grammar instruction? Does it make a difference, right? Is it necessary? Are there many other factors that might impinge on that effectiveness? And I'm going to show you really quickly results from 4 different, there are literature reviews or meta-analyses that address this question. And I'm going to encourage you to start with these 4 sources, but there are many others. Many experiments in second language acquisition are really trying to get at this question: how effective is X type of intervention, right, on student learning? So let's take a quick look here. Pull up my PDFs. At an early, by early I mean 1983, right, Michael Long, who is associated with the focus on form idea, did a review of research on addressing this question: does second language instruction make a difference? Okay, so I am just going to jump, I don't recommend this, but this is just to cut to the chase with you guys. let's look at some of his findings, right? And he had summarized different types of interventions, or different studies, I should say. He had summarized, I think, several different studies, 12 studies, and he says here, it would seem there is considerable evidence to indicate that second language instruction does make a difference. Okay, and so he talks about the different, right, stronger types of effect and things like that. And then a little bit later on, again, I do encourage you to read this. I just wanted to draw your attention to these. He does make sort of the more categorical assertion, right? Whatever the place of instruction in a theory of second language acquisition, the theories reviewed here have implication for teaching professionals. Put rather crudely, instruction is good for you, regardless of your proficiency level, of the wider linguistic environment in which you receive it, and the type of test you're going to perform on. Okay? Seems particularly useful in early stages of SLA. Okay? And later on he says, an answer to the question, does second language instruction make a difference, is a not so tentative yes. Okay? So that's one view by Michael Long. Another very, what's the word, comprehensive look at this. The original article that this is based on is over 100 pages by John Norris and Lourdes Ortega, University of Hawaii and Georgia State at the time. I think this was 2000, 2001. Does type of instruction make a difference? They looked at some interesting research questions, right? Some of these terms we've been talking about. Is an implicit or an explicit approach more effective? Can raising learners' meta-linguistic awareness, right, facilitate acquisition? Is negative feedback, so that's corrective feedback, helpful or beneficial for development, right? And so this is another article that you can look at. They basically found that, yes, instruction is beneficial, right? And then they break out the results based on type of instruction. Okay, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. I just am making the point, right, that this is something that researchers are very concerned about, right? What are those factors? So here where they're discussing their results, and they performed a meta-analysis. They looked at previous studies, categorized them, and studied their effect, right? So how effective is L2 instruction overall, right? That was their first research question, okay? Let's see. Absolutely. Okay. Suggests that instructional treatments are quite effective. Okay. So, and then they qualify that and they break it down looking at a bunch of other factors. All right. And then another really interesting take is by Rod Ellis, 2006, Current Issues in the Teaching of Grammar. He, an SLA perspective, he posed 10 questions, right? Should we teach grammar? What grammar should we teach? When should we teach it? Should it be massed or distributed? Or 8 questions, I guess, I'm sorry. Should it be intensive or extensive? Is there any value in teaching explicit grammar? What's the best way to teach grammar for implicit knowledge? So again, referencing many of the concepts I talked about earlier in the video. And he does come up with some tentative conclusions, right? So, although there is now a clear conviction that a traditional approach to teaching grammar based on explicit explanations and drill-like practice is unlikely to result in the acquisition of the implicit knowledge needed for fluent and accurate communication, there continues to be disagreement regarding what should replace this. It seems appropriate then to finish with a statement of my own beliefs. This is, again, Rod Ellis, who's a very strong voice in SLA research, okay? So he says the following, right? The grammar that should be taught should be one that emphasizes not just form, but also meanings and the use of different grammatical structures. Teachers should endeavor to focus on those grammatical structures that are known to be problematic. So again, that's what I'm trying to do on this course, is to isolate those ones that are difficult for you as learners, right? Not teach the entire grammar. In other words, some type of needs analysis might be necessary. Grammar is best taught to learners who have already acquired some ability to use the language. A focus on forms approach, again, remember, that's that traditional, right, discrete grammar point teaching, is valid as long as it includes an opportunity for learners to practice behavior and communicative tasks. Okay? So we have to go from that isolated nature of focus on forms to something a little bit more communicative, but Rod Ellis is saying teaching grammar very explicitly, explaining grammar deductively is valid as long as it leads, as long as we also include a communicative task, right? All right, what else? Should include both input and output based instructional options. I didn't talk too much about that in the video, although they are listed on that list of techniques, right? Case exists for teaching explicit grammatical knowledge as a means for assisting subsequent acquisition of implicit knowledge. This is actually, number 7 is extremely controversial. Not that he's wrong, I couldn't tell you, but I can tell you that that is what he's basically saying is, there's a case that something you learn explicitly could assist you in deepening your implicit knowledge, and a lot of people don't agree with that. That's a question in our syllabus, right? Can explicit knowledge ever become implicit knowledge? And there's an article on our Blackboard site by Van Patten that addresses that from his perspective. Experts disagree. Okay, an incidental focus on form approach is of special value. So again, remember Michael Long, focus on form, right? Because it affords an opportunity for extensive treatment of grammatical problems, right? And then corrective feedback is important for learning grammar. It is best conducted using a mixture of implicit and explicit feedback types. I didn't talk a lot about corrective feedback, but they are listed on the previous slide. So this is kind of his conclusion. In accordance with these beliefs, grammar instruction should take the form of separate grammar lessons, a focus on forms approach, and should also be integrated into communicative activities. So both focus on forms are okay, again with a communicative component, and also an more integrated communicative approach or a focus on form is recommended. So like he says here, and this is very important, many, if not all of these statements are open to challenge. So the book has not been written, the final verse has not been sung, right? There's still a lot of debate on the effectiveness of grammar instruction and how to best do that and what factors affect it. Finally, similarly, de Graaf and Hausen, they make a statement here in this chapter, Investigating the Effects of L2 Instruction. It should be on Blackboard. There are even theoretical arguments that L2 instruction may be indispensable. So is it necessary? It might be indispensable for successful acquisition, at least for some types of learners, right? Or for some aspects of the system and L2 proficiency. So again, it depends, right? What structures are we talking about? What are the characteristics of the learners? Those are things that might affect the effectiveness of grammar instruction. They have an interesting conceptualization of it here, right? Here they say instruction can, at least in principle, affect any of the 3 basic dimensions of the L2 learning process, right? So here they talk about it might affect the route of L2 acquisition, right? It might affect the rate, so it could speed it up or slow it down, and grammar instruction might affect ultimate levels of attainment or the end state of L2 learning, okay? And so they summarize some studies right here, and they say collectively these studies have led to the following claims, right? For those grammatical aspects of language which are developmentally constrained, we talked about the natural order hypothesis, right? So if a certain acquisition of control of a certain form is way up here in the developmental sequence, right? Then it says instruction seems incapable of overriding that. We can't skip just out of great instruction. Oh, the person hasn't mastered, you know, basic present tense verbs. That's okay. We're gonna teach them about the subjunctive in, you know, adverbial clauses, right? Instruction can't override the natural sequence of acquisition. When appropriately timed, instruction can assist learners to move faster. So that's that rate, right? So we can move up the natural route of development faster, right? We can accelerate. Instruction might accelerate our acquisition. And then number 3, overall, instructed learners reach higher final stages of attainment and development. In particular, instructed learners attain higher levels of grammatical accuracy than non-instructed learners. You might have just seen this anecdotally. You may have friends who are really talented at picking up languages. They might go to a foreign country and stay there for 2 or 3 weeks, and they start to sound kind of fluent, right? But they're making mistakes left and right. They don't have grammatical accuracy. So someone that's receiving instruction will surpass their level. And in some cases, instruction may even be necessary to overcome premature fossilization. So, right, fossilization is when you are you attain a certain level, right, and maybe even proficiency, but your forms are incorrect, and over time those become stuck. They become fossilized, right? And so instruction might be necessary to overcome the premature fossilization of specific grammatical subsections, right? So those are just 4 examples from the research, right, that I wanted to draw your attention to. All right. I didn't put Michael Long 1983, but Norris and Ortega 2000, 2001, Ellis 2006, and De Graaf and Hausen, that's 2009. Okay. So getting back to our syllabus, and I'm going to have you guys do you graduate students do a couple of activities that will draw on some of these concepts. One of them is the grammar activity analyses, and for this one I want you guys to go out. I haven't decided if I'm going to provide the activities or if I'm going to have you provide them, but you would begin with the activity. You would kind of work backward, identifying, okay, this activity is characteristic of X, Y, or Z approach or method, and it reflects these assumptions, these constructs, these theories, right? It reflects the belief that an inductive approach is better than a deductive approach, or it reflects the belief that learners need to acquire this structure implicitly. You're going to analyze the activity, identify positive and negative aspects, and assess its overall likely effectiveness or appropriateness. So I'm going to have you do some of those analyses of grammar activities. But I also want you guys as instructors, teachers, to be able to develop instruction plans for grammar. So in this case, you're going to sort of work backward or forward, depending on how you conceive it. You're going to start with learning objectives, right? So I want my learners to be able to use the irregular preterite verb forms, right, consistently, accurately. You're going to determine how you would teach that form or structure, and then you're going to link your decision with some kind of rationale or justification that's rooted in some of these constructs, right, that we've been talking about. You're going to design the activity, complete with instructions, and then you'll do a short reflection piece on how likely it is to be effective. Okay? I'm not sure why I didn't go full screen on these slides for the past few minutes. All right? I'll go back and let you get a good view at them. Okay? So that's the grammar activity analyses, and you'll also do the grammar instruction plans. And like I said, templates and more detailed instructions will be available. They're not yet, but they will be available on Blackboard very soon. So that's basically it for my overview of developments in teaching of grammar and where we're at right now sort of in the research when it comes to discussing grammar instruction intelligently. Hope you found it to be useful and informative. Like I said, there's a lot of labels in there, and what I want you to do is Google those. Read up on those. There are lots of articles on Blackboard, and there's lots of information available online. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.